when okay, so hello everyone. We've got a few people on right now for the webinar series. We have about 26 of you, 27 now attending, so I think a couple are still rolling in, but we'll get things started. Just as a, before I even get into too much, if there's a problem and you're either not hearing me, I guess you won't know if you're not hearing me, but if you're not seeing things correctly, you can always, you can get in touch with us through the Q&A. If you move your mouse to the bottom or top of your screen, you'll see options for Q&A, and you can type a question in there, but we can use that as well for you to communicate with us to let us know if there are any problems that you're experiencing. So I'm James Paget with Canadian Wildlife Federation. Welcome to our third installment of our webinar series for managing rights of way and other corridors for pollinator habitat. I'll also a bit other housekeeping. So we'll use the Q&A as well for questions, obviously, but and feel free to write them as we go as things pop up and you're wondering about. But we'll save the questions to the end of each end of the presentations, so that we can kind of compile the common ones and pose them to our presenters. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit about the Canadian Wildlife Federation. We are a national NGO. We cover a number of different facets of conservation, namely kind of terrestrial environments, species at risk in specifically as well, aquatic environments being both coastal, marine, and freshwater. Also have a education department working with formal areas of education like school groups, but also more informal of the general public. And on that front, and as well as the more science and conservation focus, work with to connect Canadians, young and old, to nature through various citizen science initiatives. We have a network of roughly 350,000 supporters across the country, so a large base that we can use, that we can inform people and as a platform for our conservation work. This, as I mentioned, this is the third instance of our, I guess, and our final of our webinar series. The first two, if you had a chance to partake, that's great. They're also available, the recordings of these two, and then this one, once we're done, will also be available. The web address is at the bottom, but we can also send a link around with the address as once this current one is posted. We will have that there probably in a couple of weeks, posted there. Holly is going to talk about the program itself and a little bit of background and introduce our speakers.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Holly Vegetation. I work with CWF on the Pollinator project. I just also want to draw your attention and thank both federal and provincial governments that have sponsored this webinar today, as well as the series, and a workshop that we had last month, which was really successful. CWF has been doing pollinator work for about 18 months now, directly on rights of way, working with partners around Eastern Ontario and promoting best practices and techniques on pollinator habitat restoration. So I would just like to welcome and introduce our speakers for today, who are from Lanark County. For those of you who might not be from Eastern Ontario, Lanark is a rural municipality that's between Ottawa and Kingston, partly on the Shield. There are about 70,000 people in Lanark County, and the area is about 3,035 square kilometers. So it's a good chunk of land, and our guest speakers today both work for the county. Janet Tizik is the business manager for Lanark County Public Works Department. And the department maintains the county road network, which consists of 562 kilometers of roads, as well as 77 bridge and culvert structures. As the business manager, Janet oversees the organization, administration, and financial functions of the department. She has 36 years of experience in public service, all in municipal government. So welcome, Janet. And Michelle works with Janet as the vegetation management intern in Lanark County's Department of Public Works. She's worked there during the summers from 2017. Michelle has an undergraduate degree in biology from Carleton, and she's currently enrolled in a master's program in biology, also at Carleton University. Michelle's research evaluates how agriculture affects the bird community across a broad agricultural region of Eastern Ontario, and they're going to tell us today about some of Lanark's innovative work on roadside management for pollinators. So welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
All right, so I'm just going to pause my screen sharing here, and then Janet and Michelle can start theirs. And I will unmute them as well so we can hear what they're having to say. That helps.
All right, so I think everything, you should be able to see the presentation. Well, thank you for the introduction, James and Holly. My name is Michelle. I work for Lanark County as the vegetation management intern. And I'm gonna start out by talking a little bit today about incorporating pollinator habitat into Lanark County's vegetation management plan. So to get into it, this slide is showing a little bit of our journey to pollinator restoration. And I wanted to talk about our vegetation management plan and how each of the pieces of our vegetation management plan has led us to pollinator restoration projects. We think that our journey can be a useful tool for others and other municipalities that want to get started with pollinator restoration on their own. So I'm going to go into detail about each of these pieces and provide some rates and cost savings that hopefully might be useful for others as well. So we initially started our journey into vegetation management plan from an invasive plant called wild parsnip, which was designated a noxious weed in 2015, which eventually led to the adoption of the integrated vegetation management plan. So three of the key pieces of that plan are, first off, our roadside vegetation, so where we allow desirable vegetation and at what height, our mowing and how much mowing we're doing. Secondly, our invasive plant control, so controlling wild parsnip and moving from a high intensity to a lower intensity type control measures as it becomes more effective. And lastly, the restoration, which includes things like hydroseeding and some planting and seeding as well. And this eventually has led to new projects and other pollinator habitat restoration projects, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about. So just to give you some background about wild parsnip, this plant is part of the carrot family. It spends its first year or more as a basal rosette before it does flower, and then it does flower once before it dies. It's really easy to identify when it's in flower stage. Its flowers are bright yellow and they form this sort of flat umbrella-shaped umbel. And the seeds are actually quite heavy from wild parsnip. Their average dispersal is only about 3 meters naturally, but over 75% of its movement is by human activity. Things like equipment and mowing can really contribute to the spread of wild parsnip. Wild parsnip was designated a noxious weed partially because of its impact to agriculture. So infested crops have become unsaleable as food grade quality and unmarketable as seed for farmers that have wild parsnip in their fields. The chemicals that are in wild parsnip can inhibit weight gain and fertility in livestock, and as a result, any infested hay is unsaleable as food for livestock and horses. On the environmental side, wild parsnip can outcompete native flowers into these sort of dense monocultures of just wild parsnip. And although these flowers do attract some pollinators, we know that honeybees don't visit wild parsnip. It's not the ideal pollinator. So wild parsnip also has a chemical in its sap called furanocoumarin, which is found throughout the plant, mainly in the stem, in the sap. And the chemical interacts with sunlight and causes burns and blisters and irritation to the skin and can become severe when it's exposed to the sun. And there are some reports of it potentially causing vision impairment if it's in contact with your eye. And so these blisters and rashes can be quite painful and last for several seasons. So in 2015, when wild parsnip was designated a noxious weed, the Weed Control Act came into play. And the intention of the Weed Control Act was to reduce the infestation of noxious weeds that negatively impact on agriculture and horticulture lands, and also to reduce health hazards to livestock and agricultural workers that are caused by poisonous plants. The weed inspector is then appointed by bylaw to enforce the Weed Control Act, and that person may order property owners to destroy noxious weeds, and that includes properties like roadsides. This picture gives you a sense of how heavily infested roadsides were with wild parsnip in the earlier parts of the program in 2015 and 2016. We often had wild parsnip growing in really dense monocultures along roadsides, and they're quite packed into the road. So why does Public Works care to control roadside vegetation? Well, firstly, Public Works needs to protect human safety in the roadside. That includes motorist safety, workers, volunteers, public safety, anyone who has to enter into the ditch for whatever reason. Secondly is to preserve infrastructure, so things like maintaining sightlines, intersections, curves, and visibility for wildlife crossing, the prevention of road surface erosion, and to promote proper drainage. There's also environmental benefits to controlling roadside vegetation, like controlling the spread of invasive species, protecting valued conservation areas, and importantly, reducing damage on adjacent crops. But it also provides an opportunity for establishment of pollinator habitats. And so the goal of controlling this roadside vegetation is to discourage or eliminate the undesired vegetation and promote the desired. So this eventually led to Lanark County adopting the Vegetation Management Plan back in December of 2016. So what is the Vegetation Management Plan? There are four sort of main objectives of the Vegetation Management Plan, including noxious and invasive plant management, including one of those plants being wild parsnip, vegetation control for asset maintenance, so things like safety barriers, bridges and culverts, mowing and tree removals, site restoration, which includes things like hydroseeding, overseeding, planting, and reseeding, and education and awareness, things like signage, brochures, and information session and staff training. So if you're a municipality considering an integrated vegetation management plan to control invasive plants or to manage roadside vegetation, how much is that going to cost you? And the cost really does vary a lot depending on what area you're in, the company that you choose, and then if any pre-existing plans are in your adjacent area, that's also going to factor into how much it's going to cost. But you can expect somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 to develop a vegetation management plan. So the first step in our vegetation management plan was designating where vegetation was acceptable and at what height. So from the vegetation management plan, we have this right-of-way cross-section which outlines where vegetation is allowed at what height. And so the turf and clear zones have the most restrictive height requirements, whereas the wildlife areas and beyond the ditch line have less restricted height limits. And this has dictated our mowing practices and the location of those restoration projects and at what height they can be in the roadside. Probably the easiest change and the biggest savings for us came from reduced mowing. If you're considering reducing mowing, there's sort of three parts of mowing to really consider as far as mowing practices go. Firstly, the timing of your mowing. At Lanark County, we do mowing in the spring and early summer, and this avoids seeding periods of wild parsnip, and it avoids the peak bloom times for the flowering plants that are in the roadside that we do want. Secondly, the frequency. At Lanark County, we mow twice per year, and mowing less frequently reduces the impact to pollinator plants, as they're generally weakened quickly by repetitive mowing. And lastly, the width. We mow one swath generally, which is about 6 to 7 feet, although swath size can vary depending on the municipality. But mowing less area leaves more natural pollinator habitat. And to give you an example, at Lanark County, we have over 1,100 lane kilometers. And with the implementation of this reduced mowing regime, we now have 450 hectares of roadside that are unmowed and are left to naturalize. And this has led to 37% reduction in swath kilometers and to over $11,000 in savings over the course of the program. One thing to note is that our mowing contract is based off estimated quantities, so we have some flexibility in the kilometers that we do with our contractor, although some municipalities may not have that flexibility. But if you were considering reducing mowing in the way that we have, you can expect an average savings of about $750 per swath kilometer. So for example, you have a 5,000 swath kilometers to mow, then you'd expect somewhere over $37,000 in savings. And so these savings can be quite massive depending on what kind of mowing you're doing already and how you might be thinking of reducing your mowing. As a quick side note, as I mentioned earlier, wild parsnip is predominantly spread by vehicles and equipment. And so the Clean Equipment Protocol is something that we've taken a look at, which provides guidelines on how to inspect and clean equipment to prevent invasive species from spreading. We've now included a modified version in our special provisions in our tender documents as a way to help reduce invasive plant spread in the county. So changing gears a little bit from roadside vegetation to invasive plant control, one of the challenges of controlling wild parsnip is that mowing alone is not effective. Frequent, well-timed mowing can be quite challenging with over 1,100 lane kilometers of roadway, and many ditches are not accessible for mowing due to rocky and uneven terrain. And in addition, poorly timed mowing can also contribute to the spread of the wild parsnip seeds. Another thing to keep in mind is that mowing is unselective, and it's reducing anything that is growing in the roadside and even desirable vegetation. And what we found is that wild parsnip generally dominates the native pollinator plants after mowing, as it has the taproot to use as a way to reproduce after. To give you an idea of how mowing impacts a stand of wild parsnip, this is a picture of a road allowance prior to cut. And following the cut, most of the plants have regrown and have reached flower and will likely continue on to reseed the area. So you can really tell that mowing as a sole option is not going to be effective in controlling this invasive. This is what led to the integrated approach, which started out with high-intensity practices in 2016, based off of the highly infested road system. And that began with boom spraying with a selective herbicide. Boom spraying is a broadcast spray that's applied to the entire right-of-way. But we quickly, after 2016, were able to implement spot spraying, which is a targeted approach which requires a contractor to go to each individual plant and spray with the chemical. So after 2017, we continued the trend of increasing the amount of targeted spot spraying that we were doing, reducing the amount of boom spraying, and starting to implement hand removals where it was feasible. And that trend continued into 2019, and we expect it will continue into 2020 as well. So over the course of the program, we've seen an 82% reduction in herbicide, and it has been successful. So 85% of our roads have declined in wild parsnip infestations from 2016 to 2019. The spot spraying can provide some savings as well. Since spot spraying preserves desirable vegetation, we do see a savings in restoration costs down the road. And a common misconception is that spot spraying is more expensive than boom spraying. But looking at it from a per kilometer basis, when doing this in the most appropriate areas, spot spraying is 2/3 the cost of boom spraying. And so there is quite a big benefit to going from a high intensity approach to more targeted approach. As infestations have reduced, the very light infestations can now be managed by hand. And hand removals require staff to enter into the ditch and dig up individual plants, which, as you can imagine, can be very labor intensive. And so we do have strict requirements on how much we're taking on at what infestation level. But to give you a sense, the average hand pulling rates for wild parsnip were about 0.6 kilometers per hour per person, and that's just for very light infestations. So as an example, 10 kilometers of roadway with 2 people can be done in about 8 hours. But the positive to hand removals is that it provides an opportunity for pollinator habitat restoration. And this leads into the restoration part of our vegetation management plan. So we do a lot of hydroseeding after construction, and predominantly grass seed mixes are normally applied to bare soil following those construction disturbances. Lanark County consulted with vegetation experts to improve the hydroseeding mix to now include 12 pollinator supportive plants. And over the last 3 years, we've hydroseeded about 30,000 square meters in the county. And the goal is to promote desirable pollinator-friendly plants and to prevent the growth of invasives and allowing those to enter the roadside. And the picture down below is from one of our roadsides, which we hydroseeded 2 years ago. This is from last summer. And we can start to see that the showy plants are coming in. So we've generally applied hydroseeding as seed and mulch applications in a one-step application process. In the future, we want to start looking at doing 2-stage applications where the seed and mulch are separate to hopefully improve the seed to soil contact. The cost for hydroseeding for a grass mix, based off our average rates, we expect around $1 per square meter for grass mixes. And for the custom seed mix, we had an average cost of about $1.20 per square meter, which is about 20% more than the grass mix. Of course, the application costs may vary depending on what company this is being done by. But to give you an example of an area with 20,000 square kilometers with an additional 20% cost for the custom seeds would cost about $4,000 more. So if you're a municipality that is doing hydroseeding already, it may not cost you that much more to use a custom mix over the normal grass seed mix. One thing to note is our seed mix is available online in the appendix of our integrated vegetation management plan, but we do have a version of it here, a little screen grab, which includes all of our flowering species as well as the grasses and the proportions of seed mix by weight. We've also done planting and seeding in our roadsides and on our property. We've done planting of plugs in roadsides and in pollinator patches in various locations. We've also done some seeding, so we've reseeded disturbed soil following wild parsnip removals. So as we're doing these removals by hand, we're using seeds to apply to the exposed soil to hopefully provide competition against the wild parsnip and to improve the pollinator habitat in the area. We've also seeded a pollinator patch on county property, and there's pictures of these on the right. We generally do most of our restoration work in the fall, although spring and fall can work equally as well. We do a lot of it in the fall because our spring season in public works is generally very busy, and we have the resources available in the fall to do this restoration. So to help you decide if planting or seeding is the right choice for your organization, we've included the main advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. So for planting, some of the advantages are that the plant plugs provide native plants with a better chance of survival, and they're likely going to flower sooner than if it were by seed. The downside is that it's going to take more resources to plant, it's more expensive, and generally on a smaller scale. The seeding, on the other hand, is less expensive. You can achieve a larger distribution of the seed, and it does require fewer resources. But there might be a chance of lower germination, and you're going to have to expect a longer time to reach flowering. So some cost examples for planting, depending on the density of the area we are planting, we expect somewhere between $675 to $1,500 per 100 meters. and it takes somewhere between 7 and 11 hours per 100 plants per person. So for example, 500 plants can be planted with 5 people in about 7 to 11 hours planting time on average. Hand seeding, on the other hand, is less expensive, so the cost, depending on how much seed you're putting down on your patch, is about $30 per 100 square meters. So for example, a 1,000 square meter area can be seeded with $300. And the rate is also a little bit less, so 1 hour to do 100 square meters per person. And so a 1,000 square meter area can be done with 3 people in about 3 hours. These rates can obviously change, and the choice that you make really depends on which option is going to work best for you. If you decide to seed, another thing to consider is the seed mix that you're going to use. The mix that we've used at Lanark County has 19 native species of grasses and pollinator plants that were purchased from St. William's Nursery and Ontario Seed Company. And our cost altogether was around $200 per kilogram to purchase seeds. But obviously the seed cost can vary a lot depending on the company, the seed mix that you purchase, so if it's a custom mix, the number of species in the mix and the availability, and whether or not those seeds are native. So our integrated vegetation management plan started our pollinator habitat restoration journey, and now we're going beyond just the plan. So for example, some of the pollinator projects that we're getting into now include the National Wildlife Federation's Mayor's Monarch Pledge, which is when a mayor of a municipality chooses to pledge to do a variety of activities to improve monarch habitat within their area. And so we're working on doing some activities related to the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. We are also working with some community engagement by hosting and attending public information sessions and workshops. And the Canadian Wildlife Federation has been doing a habitat restoration project, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. But we have a lot of other projects on the go, and I'm sure more to come in the future. So the Canadian Wildlife Federation launched a monarch butterfly recovery project in Eastern Ontario, and one of the test plots were on Lanark County Road. So they were testing the creation of native meadows along roadsides to control wild parsnip, restore monarch butterfly habitat, and reduce management costs. So we seeded sites on Lanark County roads in the spring of 2019, and we continued monitoring the sites throughout the season. And these results are the year 1 results from Canadian Wildlife Federation provided to us. And the monitoring results show an increase in native flowering plants at most of the sites in Lanark County, you can see on the right, but also an increase in non-native flowering plants, which was partially related to the wild parsnip that was coming in onto the other sites too. And we're still monitoring those and trying to figure out how we're going to go forward with those. But overall, very promising results, which will hopefully continue to improve this year. So how much can you expect to spend on pollinator habitat restoration? To give you an example, Lanark County has allocated $25,000 each year for pollinator projects. It really doesn't have to be a lot of money in order to do these sort of pollinator projects. They can be really small things, but they can have really big impacts. Last summer, we surveyed the flowering plants in our roadsides, and from that we saw that the average number of flowering nectar plant species along our roadsides was about 11 species. And based off of some of the surveys we did in 2017, that's over double an increase in the number of flowering plant species. So we're starting to see the results of our efforts to improve pollinator habitat on roadsides, and we're really excited to see these results. If you're interested in quantifying pollinator habitat on your property, the Rights of Way of Habitat Working Group has an excellent pollinator scorecard that helps qualify your pollinator habitat, and this is what we used for our own surveys and found it actually quite helpful. So all of this to say that in 2019, in recognition of Lanark County's efforts to implement an integrated vegetation management plan with long-term goals for pollinators, Lanark County was the very first in Canada to receive the Pollinator Roadside Managers Award for counties from the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. This was a huge validation for all of the hard work that's gone into the vegetation management plan, especially for pollinators. And it's a lesson in how to turn an invasive plant problem into a positive for pollinators. So going forward, what can you do? What I want to emphasize is that small changes can go a long way. Start out by reviewing your mowing practices, including the timing and where you can reduce the amount of mowing, and where possible, avoid doing any kind of fence-to-fence mowing because there are a lot of positive pollinators in the roadsides already that can benefit pollinators. Secondly, consider using a pollinator-friendly hydroseeding mix. Especially if you're doing hydroseeding already, this might be an easy way to incorporate pollinator habitat into your roadsides. And if you are reducing your mowing, you might expect some savings, which can be applied to the additional costs of using a pollinator-friendly mix for hydroseeding. And lastly, use an integrated approach for invasive plant management, and especially limit the amount of boom spraying. The more targeted you can be, the more effective it is. So coming back to this image of our journey to pollinator restoration, we've come a long way to do some of these pollinator projects, and we're really excited where it's going to go from here.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to take over at this point. So Michelle has walked you through our journey to pollinator restoration. And now I'm going to turn the focus on the lessons that we've learned and hopefully how they could maybe benefit you. So first off, we believe you need to establish a long-term goal for your roadsides so that you are working towards a plan. So we use that cross-section Michelle talked about that sets the zones, the desirable vegetations, and we use that as our benchmark to move forward. Using an integrated approach to invasive plant control and to include habitat restoration in that approach, because restoration does ensure long-term success. And it has a lot of positive benefits from both a restoration environmental perspective as well as the public acceptance of the program. Modifying and reducing mowing to save money, prevent the spread of invasive plants, and having a positive impact on pollinators. So those are some of the lessons that we learned. So think about what activities are important to track closely so that you can report on successes and your savings. So you might want to think about how you're going to do that and make sure you put those tools in place and have them at the beginning. Forming partnerships with different restoration groups and organizations is key. Michelle mentioned the Canadian Wildlife Federation, Pollinator Partnership. They were all very important for us moving through this process, and they can provide you with a huge amount of technical guidance with these pollinator projects. Public relations is a huge thing to take into consideration, so be sure to engage your community and foster that positive relationships. We started out, as Michelle mentioned, with the invasive plant management. That was the start of our program. And we had a lot of opposition to that, but it was very beneficial. It pushed us to adopt best practices and to becoming a leader in roadside vegetation management. So I urge you to get that community engagement at the start of your program. Provide opportunities for the public to help with both invasive plant control and pollinator habitat restoration. They will be a big benefit to you. At Lanark County, the initial public engagement, as I mentioned, was largely negative about the roadside spraying program. And now the direction has turned and it is changing the focus to pollinator habitat restoration, and we're getting those same people involved in those programs, and they're aiding with that part of it. So a key program for us was our enhanced Adopt a Road program, which I'm going to go over a little bit. So council directed our staff to come up with an alternative that would provide an opportunity for residents that wanted to opt out of the spraying adjacent to their land. So keeping in mind we were spraying the roadside, and at the same time maintain the integrity of our roadside control program. So they didn't want to have pockets of roadside left not being controlled. So that was the mandate staff was given. And the outcome was that we modified our existing Adopt a Road program, which for those that don't know, it's a long-standing, broadly recognized program that is focused on litter control and is generally utilized by social not-for-profit groups and businesses that are looking to aid their community. So we modified that and we called it our Enhanced Adopt a Road program. And what it was residents could adopt a 2-kilometer minimum stretch of roadside for a 2-year term, and they had to have a minimum of 3 volunteers. The number of volunteers was unlimited. They had to pick up litter in the spring and the fall as per the regular program. They did wild parsnip control in lieu of us doing that roadside chemical control. They assisted with planting and seeding of vegetation that met our vegetation management plan. And we wanted to ensure volunteer safety. So we made sure personal protective equipment, training materials, roadside volunteers working signs, they were all provided by the county. And we wanted to ensure that the county was protected from any liability that would come from these volunteers working on a roadside. And at the same time, we also looked at field inspections and monitoring by the county so that we could ensure the success of the program. We didn't want to see any volunteers fail, so we wanted to aid them when that was necessary. So recognizing the Enhanced Adopt a Road program volunteers, in 2019, we had 12 Enhanced Adopt a Road groups that controlled wild parsnip on approximately 60 kilometers of our roadway. They've planted and seeded sections of the roadside using resources provided by the county. And controlling wild parsnip by hand is a large contribution to our integrated vegetation management plan. And to give you an idea, initially in 2016, keeping in mind, as Michelle stated, we were doing all boom spraying that first year. Adopt a Road groups were our only integrated approach other than the mowing that we were doing. So that was a huge contribution to our plan. And they're also working with us, so collaboration and sharing of best practices. We've got groups that have put out promotional materials to help promote our program and are getting other organizations involved in it as well. So how do you talk about restoration with local government? If you're just starting that, you might be a member of the public, you might be a staff person wanting to bring this conversation to the table at your council. So the first step, we believe, is think about how restoration for pollinators may fit into the council mandate. So controlling invasive plants may provide opportunities to restore habitat for pollinators, so they may be dealing with that invasive like Lanark County was, and so look at it as a partnered program. Climate action plan, most municipalities are now looking at that, and that may provide some motivation to reduce mowing and restore the native plant habitat. Native plants do have larger roots and they sequester more CO2 than non-native. So it's a win-win in municipalities where climate action is also on the table. You need to explain to that council what's in it for them. So how staff and the public can approach council about restoration and pollinator habitat. First, you need to outline how restoration fits into their mandate, how the experts in restoration, and provide council with information from those experts. You might want to consider bringing them in to speak to council directly about the restoration efforts that you would like to do. And then you need to present your plan and emphasizing again its benefits to the municipality and ensure that it concludes with a specific request of what you're looking for from council. We recommend you start small, take their budget into consideration, and also take their resources into consideration. Some municipalities have more than others when you think about equipment and staff and available time to do these projects. We would suggest a trial restoration project, be detailed if possible, and show that you've considered the challenges and the costs and the benefits that you are going to look at. So kind of going over Lanark County's approach to council, ours was a little different, keeping in mind that we started out trying to control a very invasive plant within Lanark County. So municipal staff, local and county, so local municipalities, we are a two-tier municipality. We had workshops with presenters and they were experts from all areas of the field, and we brought those in to talk to that municipal forum. We then had public information sessions in collaboration with our local stewardship council. And then at the committee of the whole meeting, we had multiple delegations. So we had members of the public that were for and against the program. We had representatives of the agricultural community, the Pest Management Regulatory Authority from Health Canada. We had our medical officer of health. We had representatives from the Ontario Vegetation Management Association, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. We brought in our independent vegetation consultant that we worked with on our vegetation management plan. And then at the end, the public works staff did a report on the severity of the infestation levels within the county, the associated risks, and the benefits of control and the recommended plan. And then the steps that followed were the adoption of our integrated vegetation management plan, which did incorporate pollinator habitat restoration. And then we had multiple presentations on pollinator habitat and restoration projects. So that's kind of how it came about in Lanark County. But if you're not dealing with an invasive plant, you may very well be starting somewhere in a much more reduced scope that you are only dealing with the restoration side of it. So again, how to talk about the restoration, things to consider, be prepared for a no. It may not be within their mandate currently, or they may not have the funds or resources to do it at this time. Even if you get a no or a not right now, council is more aware of the issue and they may be receptive to talking about it again in the future. Productive meetings happen when you go in with good intentions and you focus on the positives. And take into consideration when the budgets are being developed for that municipality, whether it's your own, where you live, or if you're a staff person, you'll be well aware of the budget schedule. So if they're doing their budgets in September, you don't want to be coming in August to talk about restoration projects. You want to probably be asking the clerk to get on the agenda in May or June, so that if you are fortunate to get a yes, they can work that into their budget plans. So I think on that note, that ends the formal part of our presentation. We'd like to leave you with restoration doesn't have to be big and fancy. Small changes can make a big difference for pollinators, and you too have the ability to help connect the pollinator habitat corridors. And we thank you for listening with us today, and we'll open it up, I guess, for questions.
Great, thanks to both of you. I'm going to leave you unmuted just so you know, so that when I pose a question, you'll be able to just respond and we'll have to worry about keeping you on mute. One of the questions that came in was talking about, was specifically with respect to turtles, but I'm just curious. So they're wondering if you're factoring in, turtle nesting timelines along the the timing with when you do roadside mowing. But I'm wondering also beyond turtles, are there other species at risk or general species conservation issues you're thinking while you're mowing these roadsides and timing?
Yeah, we are starting to look more into how we can be better for turtle restoration and ensuring that we don't damage the nests. We do have some species at risk policies coming through this year that we'd like to implement, especially around things like grading and when we're doing any kind of shouldering work. So that is something that we're starting to take more and more into consideration as these sort of things start coming together, and especially reducing the impact of mowing on turtles too. We also,
yeah, go ahead.
Part of our, wow, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead if you had something else to add, sorry. Okay. Another question that came in is respect to invasives, and we talked a lot about wild parsnip. Are there other invasive species that were targeted that were being eliminated and in this program, and specifically with respect to Phragmites, which we all know is a large issue and pretty widespread, just as much so? Are there any experiences with that?
Yeah, we do. We have started looking at Phragmites as well. That's probably the next one on our list. But earlier in the presentation, we do include a list of our target weeds. So Phragmites is also on that list. And we are started looking at doing some kind of removal of Phragmites. This year, we do have a new remote control mower that we're hoping to use in some of the swampier areas that we see Phragmites. And it is becoming part of the plan as well, and outlined on, I think, slide 10 as well.
Okay. There's a couple of questions I'm going to try and tie together here, talking about seed mix. So thinking about the diversity of pollinator habitat, how you incorporate kind of the aim for diversity within your seed mixes. And I'm also thinking, like, when you're looking at, you know, wet areas versus drier areas, in respect to the kind of the managing the roadsides in that way. And as well, I mean, I guess we could leave it there, but as well as is there like a targeted seed rate, for native mixtures?
Yeah, we have worked a little bit with our vegetation consultant. She has a lot more experience with what seed rates are going to work where and what moisture. And I believe the seed rate is in our appendix of our vegetation management plan on slide 24, I believe. Yeah. It is something that we are not experts in, so we have turned to some of the other experts to help guide us in this process. So we recommend, yeah, talking with the experts and trying to find a mix that's going to work for you.
I think, James, I would add to that. It was one of the considerations council also left with staff, is that we do have a lot of agricultural lands within Lanark County, and some of the seed that is in our seed mix is not plants that farmers would generally want adjacent to their lands. So we have taken that into consideration when we've selected areas to use that hydroseeding mix or to seed, to ensure that we're not including seeds that are undesirable to the adjacent landowner. So for example, some farmers are opposed to a goldenrod adjacent to their property. So we've made sure that that hasn't been planted there. So we are looking somewhat case by case on that as well.
Michelle and Janet, I can add a bit to this. It's Holly. I could say that for our plots, at least in Lanark County that were along roadsides, we just lumped in some moist species that would grow in the ditch together with some dry species that would grow in the upland, because we had fairly limited restricted area and it was kind of a bit too much to separate those out and not worth it. I think if you had larger areas, you wouldn't want to be using wet seed in a dry area because it's quite expensive, so you'd want to target it. But that's how we approached it, and the rate that I targeted was about 10 kilograms a hectare. These are really small strips though, so it actually amounts to very little seed. You'd be quite surprised at what the little bags of seed look like. And we didn't specifically incorporate nesting habitats at the time, although I think some of these projects increasingly are incorporating things like bee hotels as well. So that's something that you could look at. Yeah. Oh, I'll just point out one more thing. As far as goldenrod goes, we did not add Canada goldenrod as a mix, part of the mix in any of our seed mixes, because it is, as Janet kind of alluded to, it tends to show up on its own anyway. So, and it has. So there's a pretty wide diversity of seeds available out there. So it's worth working with a grower to get the right mix. Just another question too, Jenna and Michelle. You mentioned that spot spraying works out to be less expensive. Could you have started with just spot spraying, or do you feel that boom spraying was necessary to get you where you were able to control wild parsnip?
In our situation, I don't believe we could have started with spot spraying. As Michelle had mentioned during the presentation, it really depends on the level of infestation. So as you would have picked up from some of the photos, we had a very heavy infestation on the majority of our road system. So the volume of herbicide that would have been applied using spot spraying, we believe it would have been equal or greater than what was used in boom spraying, because it wouldn't have been as controllable, and they ultimately would have been spraying the entire roadside because it was that infested. Versus as we moved from the first year of all boom spraying, we did get some good success from that program, and then we were able to look at areas and assess them based on that infestation. Did they need to stay boom spraying a second year, or could we move to a targeted spot spraying? So that's how we handled it. So in summary, no, I don't believe we could have done targeted spot spraying right from the beginning, but it certainly is something you need to be aware of and be prepared to move to quickly, and to be assessing your roadsides on multiple times per year. So we do it spring and fall.
Great. I have a kind of a question that maybe from both of your perspectives then. I wonder if you could talk about kind of what your biggest, pitfalls or challenges were with this initiative in general, and kind of what your lessons are learned from that were to guide others as they're maybe just embarking or on their way going through this.
Well, I think for me, starting in 2015, in 2014, we were getting a lot of calls from the public, so our call volumes went up really high, and it was about wild parsnip because it was that predominant within our county on the roadside. When they declared wild parsnip a noxious weed in 2015, the phone went crazy because people felt now that it was a noxious weed, it was on our road allowance and we had to do something about it. So that was really where the trigger got pulled in Lanark County. And I think, we were maybe somewhat reactive. We were thinking completely on wild parsnip control. We weren't thinking integrated vegetation management, restoration. We really were focusing very narrow on wild parsnip, and the opposition to the proposed roadside spraying program in 2016, like I said, it really pushed us to do better. And so it became a very large program in a very short period of time. So I think that was the big challenge for our department, was we weren't prepared for such a large task that had to be done so quickly. So for those who are just starting to see an invasive, if they have the time to put a plan together and include everything in it, I think that is one lesson that we really learned that could benefit others.
And I think now that we've sort of moved past just being reactive, as Janet mentioned, we started moving into restoration. And I think some of the challenges we faced was shifting that focus from looking at a spray program to pollinator habitat restoration. And so we've really been pushing that shift in focus as the program has more space to do more of this kind of work.
Okay, there's one more question. Just to clarify, is your mowing, does your mowing get done in-house, or is it all contracted out? And so if it's in-house, how did you reassign staff, or did you reassign staff? And if it's contract, how did that process work as far as changing or canceling contracts?
Okay, so first part, our mowing is done a combination of both in-house and contracted out. So the contracted out portion of our mowing is an estimated quantity tender process. So we do have the flexibility to adjust those quantities upward or downward. So we were very fortunate that way. Not all municipalities have that ability. So we focused our contractor on a certain area of the county because we are really focusing on the timing part of the mowing as well. And with our in-house mowing, we actually did some training sessions with staff. So we felt it was important that they understood why we were changing mowing practices. And we started involving them in some of the restoration. So we always have more work than we do time. So it wasn't hard to reallocate those staff resources. And in certain cases, we'd also taken on a recreational trail. So it was actually a benefit to us to have that added resources there. And we did the restoration with those staff as well. So it worked out really well for us. And I think most of our staff now are very much following what we're doing. And it's as exciting for them as it was for the few people that were initially involved in the start of the program.
That's great. That is a terrific note to end on. I think it's been really impressive and rewarding to watch what Lanark County has done, and I'm really excited to see what is yet to come. So thank you to Michelle and Janet for joining us today, taking time out of your schedules. And once again, the webinar recording will be available online, and everyone who's registered for this webinar today should receive the link in a week or two. So thanks everybody for joining in today, and we hope to bring you some more webinars in the future.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.